Good morning, everyone. Um, Today's speaker is an old guard member, and I want to precede my comments about this individual by saying to all 300 of you, if you have some sort of a topic you'd like to speak on, please volunteer. We love hearing our members speak. And Steve Varley, who will be herding the dozen monthly program chairs next year, and myself, either one of us, we'd love to hear anybody who wants to talk about something substantive. With that said, Nolan Asch was born at a very early age and graduated Columbia University in 1971 with a minor in history. Trivia question: which one is Nolan Asch, and which one is the topics of his speech? Um, since the age of 5, Nolan's been an avid student of history. You might know he has heard something or other about Alexander Hamilton, and he's spoken on a lot of different things. I really want to thank Nolan for stepping up. When I called him, he said instantaneously, he said yes. And he said, give me a couple of minutes to think about a topic. And he did, and he emailed me back in 15 minutes and said, here's my topic. And so without further ado, we all know Nolan. Nolan's going to talk about either himself or the guy on the right, depending. And so away you go, Nolan. And thank you again for speaking to us on Election Day.
Going to do it old school because it shows I got 3 days notice, and I'm doing this very rough. You guys are going to be lucky because this will be shorter than usual. First, let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt. First of all, Teddy Roosevelt hated to be called Teddy. He would get mad when someone called him Teddy. He loved being called TR. He loved being addressed by a military title, but he hated the idea of Teddy Roosevelt. He was born in 1858. He was born into a really aristocratic, high-end society. The Roosevelts, there were two groups of Roosevelts. There were the Roosevelts of Long Island that were Republicans, and there were the Roosevelts of the Hudson River that were Democrats. But Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt clan actually goes all the way back to the Schuylers. And if you remember your Alexander Hamilton married a lot. They were these people. Obviously, a male Roosevelt must have married a female Schuyler somewhere in 150 years, and hence they became called the Roosevelts. He always started his life in very poor health. He was asthmatic, he was weak, he had a hard time staying in shape. So he became a physical fitness nut, which is well known. He was a physical fitness nut his whole life. He was obsessively exercising and doing all sorts of outdoorsy things. At age 6, he had a distinct memory of being on the balcony of his townhouse in 1865 and watching Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession in New York City going past his balcony in 1865. At the age of 9, he showed many signs of being a precocious individual. At the age of 9, he actually put together a serious study of insects that he exhibited. I don't know if it got to the Metropolitan or not. Little aside, his old man was one of the people who founded this place called the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was a philanthropist. So one of his little hobbies was this thing we call the Met. Quite a family. In 1869 and 1870, he went to Europe with his parents. In 1872, he went to Egypt. This began to cultivate his cosmopolitan and internationalist view, which he kept through his whole life. He was homeschooled, and then he went to Harvard from being homeschooled. And evidently, he was able to homeschool. He said, there's too much rote, there's too much direct quoting. There isn't enough practical knowledge. In 1878, he was shocked, absolutely shocked. His father, who he adored, died suddenly when TR was at the age of 20. Now, the thing about his father that gets into Roosevelt's character is that his father bought a substitute in the Civil War. In the Civil War, it was very common for wealthy people to pay $300 in the Civil War, so they did not have to go to war, but they would hire what was called a replacement. So some poor guy would get $300 and he would go risk his life in the Civil War. Now, TR was ashamed of that. He thought that was shameful. He thought that was really beneath a real man. And this also formed his lifelong feeling, masculine courage, a belligerence, somewhat of a warlike mentality. And to Teddy Roosevelt, the worst thing you could be as a real man was to be a coward, was to be somehow cowardly. And that was another thing that was formed by him. His father left him the equivalent of today of $3 million. He was willed $3 million in today's money at the age of 20. He obviously could have retired, lived the life of a country gentleman, lived the life of an aristocrat, but he wanted no part of that. He wanted no part of that at all. He goes to Columbia Law School. He goes there for a while, and he hates it. He quits. He drops out of Columbia Law School, and he makes an incredibly unusual career choice for a blue blood: politics. Politics was considered dirty. Well, probably still today is considered dirty and nasty and beneath the true gentleman, and a thing you should not do. But he immediately decides he's going into politics. In 1879, 1 year after he gets out of college, he writes a book called The Naval War of 1812. He is obsessed with the Navy and naval matters. We'll go into this later, his whole life. The Naval War of 1812, which is written 1 year after he gets out of school, is an immediate success. It's a bestseller. It's well known. His comments upon naval matters in the War of 1812 make him well known. Now, in 1880, he has his first marriage, and it lasts 4 years. And in 1884, he's hit with a triple tragedy. In 1884, his wife gives birth to Alice, the daughter. His wife dies 2 days later. Within 11 hours, his mother dies. So his mother and his wife die within 11 hours of each other. Teddy Roosevelt either has a breakdown or retires. I've always wondered, why did Teddy Roosevelt go out to the Dakotas and become a cowboy? At this particular time, Teddy Roosevelt flees New York City, flees the Northeast, and sets himself up as a cowboy and a rancher, and tries to make his life over again. And either they say it's the brutal winter of 1886. It might be that Teddy Roosevelt has recovered from his psychological depression, if you want to call it that. And he immediately runs for mayor. He runs for mayor of New York, and he loses. There's a new president in. The president is Benjamin Harrison. You're going to have this theme show up repeatedly in his life. Henry Cabot Lodge is Teddy's lifelong best friend. And Henry Cabot Lodge is a super powerful man behind the scenes in the Republican Party and in the country. So Henry Cabot Lodge gets President Benjamin Harrison to appoint his buddy, Teddy Roosevelt, to the civil service, to be the civil service commissioner in 1886. He's very happy being the civil service commissioner from 1886 to 1895. He puts through a lot of reforms. He basically creates the civil service as we know it to this very day by constant effort. In 1895, he leaves the Civil Service Commissioner and Civil Service Commission as commissioner and becomes the head of the New York Police Department. Again, he's a big reformer, a big reformer. He fights with Boss Platt, the Republican political machine, Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine. He fights all the bosses, and he reforms the New York City Police Department. He was often known to walk the beat with the cops. He was often known to work midnight shifts with the cops because he wanted to be on site to enforce his reforms. His reforms included no more payoffs. Now, when I was a kid in Yonkers, we used to watch the cops getting payoffs. So trying to stop the cops from getting payoffs from local shop people is nothing new. But he effectively stopped the cops getting payoffs. There were what was called the blue laws, which you weren't supposed to open a business on Sunday. And of course, everybody in New York was opening their stores on Sunday, and Teddy Roosevelt shut that down. We get to 1896, and guess who's back? Henry Cabot Lodge. We have a new president, William McKinley. And Henry Cabot Lodge gets William McKinley to appoint Teddy Roosevelt Assistant Navy. And Roosevelt was a warmonger, with a lot of warmongers in those days. In 1896, 1897, let's go to war with Spain. Let's liberate Cuba. Let's do something. And he was very, very vocal. Now, the Secretary of the Navy, a guy called Long, was really lazy, incompetent. He didn't even show up for work most of the time. So what you had was de facto, Teddy Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Navy de facto. And on February 15th, 1898, the U.S. Maine blows up in Havana Harbor, and McKinley wants to talk about diplomacy, but Teddy Roosevelt has other ideas. He wants war, and Teddy Roosevelt is insubordinate. Teddy Roosevelt orders Admiral Dewey to steam into Manila Harbor and open fire. And that's what Admiral Dewey does. So Teddy Roosevelt, kind of over his job grade, kind of started the Spanish-American War. And the war starts, and of course, Teddy Roosevelt immediately forms the first U.S. Voluntary Cavalry. We know them as the Rough Riders. This is the most strange military organization probably in the history of the human race. It consists of Ivy Leaguers, athletes, cowboys, Indians, super rich people, hunters, miners, soldiers, sheriffs, and God knows who else. This is a motley crew if there ever was one. But on June 23rd, 1898, they land in Cuba. Just 8 days later, July 1, 1898, they charged San Juan Hill, the very famous attack of the Rough Riders on San Juan Hill. Teddy Roosevelt referred to it afterwards as, quote, the great day of my life, unquote, or, quote, my crowded hour. He constantly referred to the charge on San Juan Hill. And if he wasn't a national figure and a national idol before, he certainly was then. Here's one that we can relate to at a very high level. They came back from Cuba in August of 1898, but they were forced to go to Montauk Point, all the way out at the end of Long Island. Now, why were they forced to go to Montauk Point? Because they were in quarantine. They were being quarantined because there was a yellow fever epidemic in Cuba. So they forced them to go all the way out to the end of Long Island and quarantine themselves before they'd come into New York City. Now, in 1898, he becomes the governor of New York, and he sets up a lot of the things that he's going to do in his presidency, a lot of the tactics he uses in his presidency. Teddy Roosevelt's unheard of, twice daily press conferences when he's governor of New York. He's dominating the news. He's dominating the media. He's dominating the public mind. And he's already thinking about, he's so ambitious, he's already thinking about a 1904 presidential run, because everybody knows that William McKinley is going to be president until 1904, obviously. Then fate takes another turn. In 1899, the vice president, a guy called Hobart, dies. And Boss Platt wants TR out of New York State. He doesn't want anything to do with him. He doesn't want to be any bothered with him. And of course, they put him into the most powerless, irrelevant position you can possibly have, right? Vice President of the United States. Definitely just a nothing job. And when McKinley runs for re-election in 1900, Teddy Roosevelt makes 480 campaign stops in 23 states. 480 campaign stops in 23 states. I mean, talk about the energy. This guy was like a dynamo. We know from seeing certain things of him and hearing about him, his energy level must have been superhuman. The first time, and he's going to say this many times, but his idea of diplomacy, the first time he says it is in 1900, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick. And as we now know, in September 6th of 1901, McKinley is shot in Buffalo. TR visits him. It looks fine. The president should be okay. September 7th, he heads back to the Adirondacks to his vacation place. And a week later, he's grabbed on September 14th. McKinley is dead. Now we have another famous quote from Mark Hanna, the Republican National Committee chairman, quote, now that damned cowboy is president. And the bosses and the machine really should have felt bad about this. Now, Roosevelt had a lot of ideas and a lot of things he wanted to do. He was also very much a big advocate for African-American rights long before it was fashionable. While he was president, he desegregated the military, and he shocked the whole country by inviting Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. Booker T. Washington goes to the White House for dinner, and sign of the times, the whole country goes berserk. The whole country condemns him like crazy. So Roosevelt is a bit of a politician, so he does not repeat that particular performance. Roosevelt is to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, a lot. But contrary to popular opinion, TR was more of a trust regulator than a trust buster. He preferred to regulate the monopolies rather than bust them up. And we're going to see some examples of that a little bit ahead of us now. In 1902, he establishes the Department of Labor. And basically, he started regulating everything. I mean, he was a micromanager. He was regulating everything under the sun. He even regulated the picture on a coin. They had a new coin that was minted when he was president, and he didn't like the way it looked, so he changed the way that it looked. May 1902, you have a coal strike. You got to remember, this is before oil and gas was anything. This is before you had cars. This is before you had anything. Coal was God. I mean, coal was absolutely God in the United States of America in 1902. And TR set up an arbitration, and the coal industry was represented by a guy called J.P. Morgan. You might have heard of him. And TR took the other side, and they made a deal. The coal miners got more pay, fewer hours, but no union. No union. And he became the first president ever to settle a labor dispute. It was a first. He had a lot of firsts. Now, another superpower in those days, aside from the coal industry, of course, were the railroads. The railroads were gigantic monopolies and gigantic powerhouses. And TR got past the Hepburn Act in 1906. The Hepburn Act empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate rates and charge just and reasonable, force the railroads to charge just and reasonable rates. And the railroads had the right to appeal these just and reasonable rates. So railroad rates, in the United States became regulated by the courts in the end, because the ICC would make a ruling, the railroads would say it's unfair, the rates are too low, they'd go to court, and then the court would decide. Also in 1906, he passed the Food Drug Act. We know something called the FDA. The FDA. Roosevelt invented the FDA. He was very much influenced by The Jungle, a very famous muckraking book by Upton Sinclair, that if you've ever read it, the shocking nature of the meatpacking and food processing industry in the early 1900s, man, you think the COVID was bad on the meatpackers this year. It was nothing compared to the conditions that existed in the jungle when they were processing meat before the Food and Drug Administration. Now, his pride and joy, the thing he loved more than anything else, was conservation. He was a naturalist his whole life. He loved the outdoors. He loved being out with the wildlife. And Roosevelt really created the national park system that we all know and love to this very day. He created 5 national parks. He invented something called the U.S. Forest Service. He passed the Antiquities Act. You've had litigation about the Antiquities Act this very year. The Antiquities Act gave the president all kinds of powers to create on his own monuments, new monuments. We have lots and lots of, he created 18, and we had very, very many more. And at the end, he had preserved 230 million acres, 230 million acres, Teddy Roosevelt preserved as national park. And executive orders. I mean, again, Teddy Roosevelt was wild about wielding his power with executive orders. During his presidency, Roosevelt put in 1,080 executive orders. The first 25 presidents before him, all 25 of them put in 1,260. So the first 25 were 1,260, and number 26, Roosevelt, was 1,081. I didn't stress this, and I probably stressed it before, but I think it's worth stressing it again. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt invented the 20th century presidency. The 20th century presidency was nothing like ever again after Teddy Roosevelt than before Teddy Roosevelt. He loved to use the phrase the bully pulpit, the bully pulpit. If he didn't like what something was going on, what somebody was doing, he'd go to the newspapers, he'd have a press conference, he'd denounce Corporation A or Corporation B, or say that this practice should be changed, and he'd get a huge public response, and sometimes it would work. He loved the media. He had two, as I said before, as president again, he had 2 press conferences a day. He was constantly interacting with the media. And he invented something called the White House briefing room. You might have heard of it. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to have 2 briefings a day. He didn't really give a damn about the weather. So when the weather started to being bad, instead of having press conferences outdoors, he would have them indoors. And pretty soon he was having daily indoor news briefings twice a day. And he had tremendous access, of course. Tremendous access was given to the press. And partly because he was such good news, he got usually very good press. He had very good relations with the press, which is very unusual, as we know, probably over the last 50, 75 years. Usually it's adversarial between the president and the press. But Roosevelt had a very good relationship and got very good publicity from the press. Now, 1904, he's running for election. He'd never been elected before. McKinley was shot just after he was elected. So Roosevelt had been president for over 3 years. And if he was reelected in 1904, he would be president for 7 years in 1908. And the George Washington precedent was huge. So Roosevelt made a promise he later came to regret very bitterly. Roosevelt promised that if he was elected in 1904, he would not run for reelection in 1908. He made this promise solemnly and constantly. And of course, he won. He won by a huge margin. His second term, I gave a talk to you guys, which probably not too many people would remember or was too well received. 6 years for president, why not? Just about every president after year 6 bogs down. And Teddy Roosevelt was no exception. As popular as he was, as much he was elected, in 1904 by a huge margin. By 1906, he was a lame duck. He couldn't get much of anything done. He was fading into the woodwork as a lame duck. Of course, in 1908, the next best thing, as Vladimir Putin realized by putting his puppet Medvedev into the Kremlin, the best thing to getting a third term or getting more time is getting your puppet or your boy into the White House. William Taft was Teddy Roosevelt's boy. They were best of friends since 1890. He used him in all kinds of dirty jobs. He used him to try to put down the Philippine Rebellion. He used them to try to do a bunch of other things. He was Teddy's boy. I mean, William Taft was Teddy's boy. And of course, Taft won election. Oh, in the Republican convention of 1908, Roosevelt was so popular that you have these so-called, spontaneous demonstrations, quote unquote, in these conventions. You had a real demonstration in the 1908 Republican convention. They were screaming, 4 more years, 4 more years. They wanted Teddy Roosevelt to run in 1908 Once again, his spokesman is Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge comes down and says he will not seek a third term. So on that basis, they nominate William Taft. And let me flash back. Let me flash back to the election of 1904. The tradition up until 1904 was presidents never openly campaigned to be elected or reelected. And Teddy Roosevelt did not even break that directly. He found a slick way to get around it. He would have guys like William Taft and Henry Cabot Lodge during the campaign. They would come out and say things on behalf of Teddy Roosevelt. But it was so strong, he broke so many precedents in his presidency, but he did not break this one, that no sitting president or even, no sitting president would actively campaign for election or re-election. So in 1909, Teddy Roosevelt goes off to Africa. He's a restless guy. He's a macho man. He goes off to Africa, goes on safari, and he killed 11,000 animals. Boy, those were different days. Let's flash back to some of the behaviors and attitudes that were back then that we now find abhorrent. Imperialism, racism, this shooting of 11,000 animals, rhinos and elephants and every kind of animal, and reveling in it and being proud. I've been to Sagamore Hill, and it's loaded with the heads of all kinds of animals. They're all over the walls everywhere. And that was a certain portion of the population anyway. That was their way of life. Now, he's in Africa, but it doesn't stop him from getting telegraphs back from what William Howard Taft is doing in the White House. Now, William Howard Taft had to be the ultimate nice guy. He never wanted to be president of the United States. Absolutely not. It's a separate story. He wanted to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and much later he became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was not a guy who cared for politics. He thought he was trying to do what Teddy wanted him to do. But of course, if you're not a perfect puppet, you're not doing what Teddy wants to do. So despite Taft's best efforts, I think, to be genial and to go along with TR was getting increasingly angry. And TR, in the second term also, was moving more and more to the left, more and more to what was to become soon the Progressive Party. By 1910, you basically had Teddy Roosevelt making state speeches that you would never imagine he would make. He preferred labor over capital. That was a shockaroo in 1910. And he joins up with William La Follette and Hiram Johnson, governor of California, and they help create the Progressive Party, a real political party that is progressive, that is far forward-looking than the Republican Party and maybe even the Democratic Party. So in November 1911, he's back from Africa. Teddy starts out with a quote. "I feel sorry for Taft. He means well. I feel sorry for Taft. He means well. He's trying to do what I want him to do, but he's not doing anywhere near as good a job as I would do. I'm sure about that." So he runs as the progressive candidate. And of course, he runs like a wild man, and he runs everywhere. And on October 14th, 1912, a month before the election, he's shot in the chest while he's making a speech, and he stays there. He stands up and says, "I'm like Nolan. I'm going to finish my speech. I'm not done talking." Teddy Roosevelt stays up there with a bullet in his chest, bleeding for an hour and a half till he completes his remarks. Makes me look like a piker. And he then goes to the hospital. He says, "You can't kill a bull moose. Bullet to the chest will not kill a bull moose. I'm still going." And of course, he lost. But the election of 1912 is the only election in U.S. history ever where the third party came in second. Teddy Roosevelt beat Taft. He came in second. That's how popular he was. Of course, Woodrow Wilson won because the Republicans split themselves between Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. But Teddy Roosevelt ran a strong second, which is unheard of. Not George Wallace, not Ross Perot, not anybody else we've heard of in our lifetimes came close to coming in second. But he did that. Now, in 1913, he's been all over Africa. So where's the wild man going to go next? He's going to go to South America. He's going to take an expedition in the jungles of South America to go in all these rivers with National Geographic, doing all this stuff. And for some reason, I guess he was trying to grab a canoe or something was floating down the river. He went into the river and he got hit by a canoe and he got injured in his leg. It only becomes important because it became infected and became somewhat gangrenous. And like Hamilton, he had a very serious recurrence of his malaria. His malaria came back. The bullet in the chest was never taken out of his chest. So the guy's got a bullet in his chest. He's got malaria. He's got recurrence of malaria. He's got a serious leg injury. He's very sick. He's running 103, 104 fever. They have to stop the expedition for 2 weeks. Luckily, he probably would have died, but they did have a doctor. The doctor and his son were 24/7 giving him care. And he was very, very, very sick man. And finally, he did come back. And people who saw him said they couldn't even recognize him. He had lost 50 pounds. He had aged tremendously. And as he said, I think quite prophetically, unfortunately, it took 10 years off my life. It probably did take 10 years off his life. He came back very, very different, a different person. Now, getting close to World War I, he was huge. Being a war guy, he was huge for us getting into the war. He was PO'd at Wilson in 1914, 1915, 1916. Let's get in the fight. Let's get in the war. Let's go. But Wilson did not do so, of course, until 1917. Teddy Roosevelt, being Teddy Roosevelt, he petitioned Wilson to form Rough Riders 2. He was going to lead a new volunteer operation of the Rough Riders, a guy who's sick as a dog, who's an old man. But of course, Wilson probably would have said no in any event. But of course, he said no. That was not true. That was not going to happen. And he encouraged all his sons, to sign into the military and pushed them hard to do it. All of his sons did go into the military and decide to do it. His son Quentin was a pilot in World War I. He was a pilot. He was shot down in July 1918. He was killed. People say, again, just like Alexander Hamilton, when your son is dead, your life is over. People say the Amazon aged him 10 years. Seeing that he had pushed his son to be a pilot in World War I, shot dead, broke his heart in 1918. And within 1 year, he was dead. Even in 1919, they were still thinking of Teddy Roosevelt as a potential nominee in 1920. But Teddy Roosevelt died in his sleep of an embolism. And one of the eulogists, I remember this one. This is another great quote. Quote, "Death had to come for Teddy at night because it came in the daylight, there would have been a fight." Sorry for all the Rough Rider nature of this presentation, but I did it on 3 days notice. So hopefully I can answer some questions and you won't be heartbroken. It was a little short.
Okay, John Baxter, you're the first blue hand. Go.
John Baxter, you?
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, Nolan?
Yeah.
All right. If you read much about Teddy Roosevelt, and you described him perfectly, he was a very, very large ego. And he had a daughter, Alice. That was the girl that died from the mother after 4 days or whatever, at the same time as his mother. His wife and his mother died. The little girl was raised by his sister, and her name, of course, was Alice Longworth, her final name. And she has a very famous quote about her father, said that he wanted to be the bride in every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He needed a lot of attention. So you described him perfectly. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up Alice Longworth because she lived into the 1960s. And if any of you were watching politics or government in the 1960s, Alice was still mouthing off, criticizing presidents, putting her nose in all kinds of things. And yes, TR was a supreme egotist, a supreme egotist. No limit to his confidence.
Right.
Okay, Don Young, you're up.
Okay, am I,
You're good.
I'm good? Okay. Nolan, I wonder about something that you didn't mention, but I suspect it's another highlight. In the early 1900s, I guess 1905, 1910 or so, there was a tremendous amount of activity, antitrust type activity, and breaking up of monopolies like Standard Oil, et cetera. And a lot of it was led in the Supreme Court by the guy who became known as Wild Bill Donovan from Buffalo, who I suspect was operating to a large amount with TR's blessing. Could you comment on that? Especially the fact that Bill Donovan won more cases before the Supreme Court than anyone else up until that time, and maybe anyone else ever.
It looks like Nolan is locked. Give it a second here.
Not.
You're back. Go, Nolan.
I'm unstable, but I'm back. Okay, as I mentioned, TR, contrary to popular opinion, was more a trust regulator than a trust buster. William Howard Taft broke up Standard Oil in 1911. William Howard Taft, ironically enough, was much more of a trust buster than TR. TR brought the country to believe in that. As I mentioned a few times, he negotiated with J.P. Morgan on the coal strike. He negotiated on the Hepburn Act. He did break up some trusts, but he was, contrary to what we learned in school, he was a trust regulator. He believed there were good trusts and bad trusts, and some monopolies were good and some monopolies were bad. And he did not go on the warpath against the trusts as much as we learned in school.
Okay, Rick Jager, next.
Nolan, you did a great talk on short notice. Congratulations. Teddy Roosevelt seems to, TR seems to have been a very strange fit into the various political parties. I guess officially and nominally, he was a Republican for most of his life, but he seemed to have a lot of Democratic leanings. And of course, maybe you can fill in a little bit as to how he came to, I guess, leave the Republican Party and start the Bull Moose Party, which of course would have been an alternative to both of the political parties. Thanks.
Okay, let's go all the way back, even back to the 1880s. TR was always a reformer. The Republican Party was dominated by the bosses and corruption. So though TR was a good Republican from a Republican family, from the very beginning, he was constantly a reformer, a maverick inside the Republican Party. And the bosses were not in love with him, and he was not in love with the party bosses. And what happened really is, as I said, he regretted not running for re-election in 1908, although he promised it. He was still a Republican. He wanted the Republican nomination in 1912. They gave it to Taft, and he had already decided that if he couldn't get the Republican nomination, he was going to have his own party, which was the Progressives. And he wasn't alone. He went leftist more and more his whole life, and he was very far left of the normal Republican Party. By night, it was not a big jump for him to become a progressive. He never became a Democrat. He wouldn't go to that much of a sin, but he did co-invent the Progressive Party. He never was a typical, quote unquote, typical Republican his whole life. He was always TR. He had his own party. It was him.
Miguel, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. No, first I have three things. First of all, a clarification. Remind everybody that around 1972, the Democrats and the Republicans flipped sides with Nixon's strategy. So when you hear progressive Republicans in 1908, you should also be thinking progressive Democrat in 2008, because they flipped sides, literally. So two questions. One is, could you repeat the connection to Alexander Hamilton and the Schuyler? And the second question is, the Spanish-American War, the battleship Maine. Do you have any opinions on that? Some people think that was an inside instigation.
Great, two great questions as usual. The connections with the Schuylers, let's go back to the Revolutionary War when the Schuyler family was one of the most prestigious families, and amazingly, Eliza Hamilton married this nobody, Alexander Hamilton. So you have the Schuyler family. She had two sisters, so it was not a direct descendant of hers, or they'd be called Hamiltons. But clearly, somewhere over a 125-year period, one of the Schuyler sisters or a Schuyler woman married a Roosevelt man. So the line was carried through women.
I got you.
Directly back. That's how you get the connection between the Roosevelts and the Schuylers. And boy, I'm giving you too much history. But the fortune of the Democratic Roosevelts was made by Israel Roosevelt, who invested in 1784 in the Bank of New York, founded by Alexander Hamilton. So both sides of the Roosevelts have Hamilton connections. What was the other one?
Spanish-American War.
Oh, the Maine.
The battleship Maine.
Remember the Maine. Yeah, I mean, I hate conspiracy theories. I don't believe any of the JFK conspiracy theories. I very, very, very seldom believe conspiracy theories, but they never did truly find out what caused the explosion in the Maine. And I would not be surprised at all if it was a setup job. There was tons of agitation to take Cuba, to go to war with Spain. TR was amongst that crowd. That was a big percentage of the population, a big percentage of the military. So I could believe that in a nanosecond. They wanted to blame it on somebody else, but I wouldn't be surprised, because Roosevelt jumped all over. He should not have had the authority to order Dewey into Manila Bay, but he did. They just couldn't wait to get to war. So I think it's highly plausible.
Okay, Vic Garber, you're up.
Very enlightening again, and all enjoyable. Two questions. He was placed at Mount Rushmore, and I think there's an interesting story about that. I'd like to hear your read on that. And the other question was about, he won the Nobel Peace Prize negotiating a settlement with Japan and Russia. I'd like to hear about your comments about those two subjects. Thank you.
Okay, great comments. Yeah, I had some notes about that, and I didn't go into another little minor thing I overlooked is something called the Panama Canal. Two gigantic things in foreign policy. Yeah, duh. My notes are a little sloppy when I'm not easily looking at them. The Nobel Peace Prize came about, amazingly enough. We had wanted good relationships with Japan from the 1870s on. We tried to have good relationships with Japan. One of TR's classmates at Harvard was a senior Japanese diplomat. He asked Roosevelt to mediate the Russo-Japanese War, which took place in 1904. He called him to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He successfully negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War that was perceived all around the world as fair and even-handed and willing to be lasting, and he deserved and received the Nobel Prize. Let me go to the Panama Canal because, oh my God, that's negligence. Roosevelt wanted the Panama Canal like nobody's business. And there were two routes really they were considering. One was through Panama and one was through Nicaragua. And they decided on the one through Panama, But Panama was actually a part of Colombia at the time. They were a rebellious province of Colombia. Again, I guess Roosevelt, the imperialist, clearly the United States set up a revolution in Panama. They declared their independence and immediately granted the United States access through the Isthmus of Panama to the Panama, what we now call the Panama Canal. I think there was some dirty pool in that one, as there was some dirty pool in the Main. I guess Roosevelt wasn't too fussy about imperialism. Mount Rushmore, I gotta say, my ego's not as big as TR's. I don't know. He was certainly the most recent of the ones that were sculpted. He was the one closest to current events when he was sculpted. But it gives you an idea of just how popular and powerful Roosevelt was. I mean, he was president for 7 years. He could have been reelected for another 4 years. He waited till 1912 and came in second in a three-party race. And they were still talking about him when he died. They were still talking about him in 1919 as a contender for the Republican nomination. I don't know when they put the whole Mount Rushmore thing together, but he cast a very large shadow, particularly until the 1930s. I really can't answer, Vic.
It was my understanding that the sculpture, they ran out of funds and so forth, but he was enamored with TR, and that's how he placed him on Mount Rushmore. Thank you very much.
Yeah, he was hugely popular. And I left out the teddy bear, the most important thing of all, the teddy bear. Yes, the teddy bear came about because of Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know all the little details, but the teddy bear is one of those little things that come from TR.
Teddy bear had to be something to do with American capitalism. I think Ron Hoke, you're up next.
Thanks, Nolan. Another great presentation. One other thing that just to build on the question about the sinking of the Maine, many years later, it was discovered that the explosion that resulted in sinking the Maine originated inside the ship. It was not an explosion from the outside of the ship. So it was not something that had been done as originally talked about by the Spanish government.
Yeah, as I said, I'm pretty skeptical of conspiracy theories, so I'm willing to admit I've heard it posited that it was an explosion that was just a mechanical failure, that it was just an accident and it wasn't sabotage. So I'm perfectly willing to believe that, or believe that it was some sort of sabotage. I don't know. I really don't know.
Okay, Ken Lindhorst, you're up.
Thank you. And Nolan, congratulations. No apologies are necessary, whether you worked on this for 3 days or 3 weeks. I just wanted to comment, not a question, but a comment that in terms of your trust busting versus regulation. During the period AT&T was under Justice Department review pretty much constantly. And in 1913, they decided, because Taft was beginning to be a trust buster, that they would enter into an agreement with the Justice Department, which was called the Kingsbury Commitment. What had been happening was that they were buying up all these small telephone companies and consolidating across the United States. They were doing it on the basis of technology they had, which was called a repeater. But in any event, as a result of that regulatory agreement called the Kingsbury Commitment, the Bell system never serviced more than half of the geographic area of the United States. Now, what they didn't service was mostly mountains and prairies and at the bottom of the Colorado River. But they were able to hold off actually trust busting and divestiture until 1984 as a result of their ability to negotiate deals. So that's just a piece of history that goes back to what you were suggesting.
Mm-hmm. Another thing hits me on the head. You know whose trusts never got busted? J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was the Federal Reserve before there was a Federal Reserve. He bailed out the United States government multiple times. And General Electric never got busted up. United States Steel never got busted up. The government was actually afraid of JP. They should well have been afraid of JP Morgan. They didn't touch any of his trusts. Little footnote.
Okay, Steve Varley.
Nolan, great job on short notice. Thank you so much. You had mentioned the tragic death of TR's son, Quentin, during World War I. Years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the gravesite of another of TR's sons, Theodore III. He's buried in the American cemetery at Normandy, and he apparently was quite the soldier as well. Any thoughts on Theodore III?
Oh, yes. I forget which movie, but Henry Fonda played him, so you know he counted. TR III followed in his father's footsteps. He was a very belligerent, very militaristic. Matter of fact, he was quite old by that point, and they didn't want him to be involved in any kind of combat, partly because he's related to the dead president, Teddy Roosevelt, and partly because he's an old man, and he was not having any of it. Mm-hmm. And it cost him his life. He was a bull moose to the end too.
Where are we here? John Macheda.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm amazed that you could prepare something like this on such a short notice. My question is, could you comment on a relationship between TR and his relative FDR? One was the Republican of bull moose, the other one was a Democrat, so I can see some built-in tensions there.
Yes. And actually it was quite good. And there he broke party lines because Eleanor Roosevelt, his close relative, married Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat. And amazingly enough, well, first of all, they moved the date of the wedding so the president could give the bride away. So let's start with that. Teddy Roosevelt gave away Eleanor Roosevelt to FDR in 1905 personally. And they had to juggle government functions and all kinds of functions to do this. Actually, Teddy Roosevelt never was one for hitting at the opposition too hard. He was more building up himself than attacking the enemy, quote unquote. But after having said that, as maybe with Donald and Putin, there's not a negative word TR ever spoke against FDR in public. He never said any, although a leading Republican and a leading Democrat, you're right, family first, I guess. He never, ever criticized FDR. And FDR never criticized Teddy Roosevelt, even before death and after death. So they had a definite truce at a minimum. Absolutely. A special relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fred Honnold.
Got to unmute. Fred, unmute.
Got it. Okay, just did. Thank you. Hey, Nolan, great job as always.
Hey, great, buddy. Good to see you.
Yeah, I think you are now an honorary Rough Rider in all respects. So thank you for taking the two-part question here. Roosevelt had a profound impact. Now, this one is speculation, but if he had not been president, how would the U.S. have been different, number one? Part two is, given his hard-charging attitude, later in his life, in his final years, did he ever have any reflection? Seems like he was full speed ahead all the time. Did he ever reflect? So again, two parts. If he had not been elected, what might not have changed, would have been different? And did he reflect in his later years?
Well, you know, historians hate hypotheticals, but I love you, so I'm going to try it.
Okay, thank you.
I think the United States was moving inexorably into the modern era. They were moving into an era where you had to regulate business, where someone was, whether, you know, Woodrow Wilson was very big on deregulation. So if FDR had not been if TR had not been president, I imagine much the same things would have happened, but later. I think he accelerated the trends that were driving the 20th century, and he made them come more rapidly. But I think that much of the same things would have come 5 years or 10 years later. He was never, to go to your second question, I cannot remember him ever saying anything reflective. He's like a wild man shooting off all his guns all the time. And just, you know, he never slowed down. down. He never seemed to. A good example that I was going to use in the talk, but I cut it short. TR would invite usually 3 people to the White House, 3 world experts on 3 different fields, let's say history and mathematics and biology. And he would talk to all 3 of them at once. And he could keep up with world experts in 3 fields simultaneously. His brain, I guess, never slowed down at all. And I never picked up a reflexive bone in his body. You know, I just, I'm going through my memory banks. I can't, I don't get it. No.
It was alleged
I don't
that
think
he
so.
read,
Not that I know of.
it was alleged that he read a book a day. Is that true or is that just mythology?
That's true. I was going to get to that. It is alleged that he read 10,000 books in his lifetime. He's a genius for sure. Having world experts on 3 subjects to debate with them simultaneously and hold his own, reading supposedly 10,000 books. He definitely was a genius. There's no doubt about it. But of course, to him, the physical was even more important than the mental, as I was coming with. But you're right. He was a full-blown intellectual of the first order, which I did not address at all, probably. As usual, good point.
Thank you. Thank you, Nolan.
Vic Garber again. Vic, is your hand up just as a legacy? Let's
Maybe.
move on.
Okay, there, I think I'm there now.
Okay, now Vic.
I think it was his brother Elliot who was the rising star in the family, and he ended up having a terrible life. Do you think that affected TR a lot?
You're talking about his brother?
His brother, yeah. I think
Yeah, his
name is
brother.
Elliot. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, his brother did have a sad and terrible life, and I'm sure, again, getting back to what was just said, he never seemed to be reflective. You know, he never seemed to be introspective ever about anything. I've never heard a word in print about how he reacted to his poor brother or anybody else, really. I don't get the sense that it affected the arc of his life very much at all. I don't think he was an empathetic kind of guy.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I just don't
Bill?
have a lot to contribute.
Yeah, this is a last minute question because most of your comments, Nolan, they show admiration for TR, but he was sort of a character, and I wonder whether you ever come across an extreme kind of psychological thing that he maybe wasn't such a nice guy.
Well, I do admire, on balance, I do admire him. You know, just like Winston Churchill, I admire him, but he has a lot of flaws. TR has some of the same flaws that Winston Churchill has. He was a racist. He was an imperialist. He did not really care about other people's feelings. If I want to run down TR, there are things you could say, but he was honest. He was clearly, unimpeachably honest. You know, I admire a public servant who's actually a public servant, who's actually incredibly honest, who goes into the 1880s when everybody is corrupt, and it cost him to be a reformer, but he was a reformer. When you could believe what he said what he meant, and he meant what he said. I'm on balance. I'm pretty, you know, you can ding him with all the faults of his generation. I mean, he's definitely an imperialist, full-fledged, definitely a racist, full-fledged. On one hand, he sets up the National Park Service. On the other hand, he slaughters tens of thousands of animals. There's a little contradiction there. But yeah, on balance, I'd give him a B at least. I'd give him a pretty good grade. As a president,
maybe you really have to admire an honest person, even if you don't agree with some of the. I think a neurosis. It's usually you know you're under the covers. You know you're not honest with yourself or anybody else. He was always very direct. it appears.
Yes. And he insisted on a code of honor, and his children, he drilled it into them, as was nicely pointed out by Steve. His son was like in his 50s in World War II. He volunteered for combat. He got killed. To TR, the worst thing was to be a coward. Better to die in battle than to be a coward. I mean, he believed that to his bones.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bill. Officially, I need to just say that it's 11:33, and I know we're having people drop off, and you guys know the drill. If you want to leave, you leave, and if you don't, you don't. So we're going to continue, and I'm going to take privilege right now to just mention something. If you watch the Tom Selleck police show, there's a picture of TR in back of him in the police commissioner's office. I think that's for real. But, you know, TR was the police commissioner in New York City, and I think is much beloved by the department even today. Any comments on that, Nolan?
Well, as I mentioned, he was New York City police commissioner in 1895, and he cleaned up the New York City Police Department, which was extremely corrupt at that point. And as I said, he walked the beat with the cops. He went around to all the stores to make sure they weren't taking bribes. He really reinvented the NYPD we know today. Not surprised that they have something of him in the Blue Bloods show. You know, I think the NYPD, again, there's been corrupt and there's been some ugly eras for the NYPD. I can remember Serpico and some other things. But he made the NYPD a respected, honest, legitimate organization. And I think by and large, it's held. I mean, there've been certain eras that were kind of ugly temporarily. But yeah, that's an excellent insight. It would make perfect sense that the NYPD had something to remember TR by.
Rich Connolly, a new questioner. Unmute yourself and go.
I have to be unmuted.
You are.
Okay. Just a quick comment. If anyone wants to read more detail about TR's trip to the Amazon, I would suggest a book called River of Doubt by Candace Millard. It's a really in-depth study of his whole trip, and it's quite good. Thank you.
Good point.
Okay.
Good book. Good book.
Yeah. And I'm counting on somebody putting that in the chat, the Amazon link. We always do that. I'm going to skip a little bit here and catch the people who have not asked at least one question already. So Jim Blinn, go.
Yes, when you mentioned River of Doubt, there was on TV in the last few weeks. I don't remember if it was on PBS or National Geographic, but there was a show that detailed his trip through the River of Doubt. It was quite fascinating and terrifying.
Okay, and in this day and age, you never know when it doesn't get repeated, or at worst case, you can pay $3, $5 or something like that to rent a TV show like that later on. Thank you, Jim. Let's see, back to the top. Miguel.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment. Roosevelt did capture Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War in 1903. He was smart enough not to try to attack El Morro, the fort. They came in through the marshes in the back. But I just wanted to say that he is very highly regarded among my parents' and grandparents' generation in Puerto Rico. I mean, when I was in first grade, I went to the Roosevelt School. The main avenue in Mayagüez, which is the third largest city, is Avenida Roosevelt. So he does have a very high regard in Puerto Rico. He's not, considered an invader. So I just thought I would throw that in.
Very good. Let's see, Fred Arnold seems to be the last one. So let's make Fred the last questioner.
Can I make one comment before you start, Fred?
Yes.
When we finish, as soon as we finish the Q&A, I'm going to unmute everybody or send an unmute request so we can do the final ceremony, which means you all have to be quiet at that point and turn off your radios and stop talking to the person next to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Nolan, just a brief comment and then another question. We talked about Roosevelt, TR, at the end of his life. I want to ask you something about the beginning, but you had mentioned with the Rough Riders, he attracted a group of landed gentlemen, wealthy individuals, athletes. From my reading over the years, a bit of local trivia is the old mansion at Oak Knoll School on Blackburn Road, where Lorne had lived, and he extensively owned what I believe now is Memorial Field and a lot of property around. His son was one of TR's Rough Riders. His son also won the US Open 5 years in a row, came back from the war and went on to win a few more times. It's, I think, along with Bjorn Borg, the only other one to win 5 in a row. But it's just interesting to your point. That's a local bit. Here's the question. TR, you said, was honest, which obviously in politics is a rare commodity that maybe comes around once every few decades. We believe a Lincoln, we believe a TR, we believe a Washington. What was the character formation of TR that brought him to this way? Was it a elder? Was it some influence of a teacher? Was it a reading? Or simply was that his DNA?
Well, I think, as I said in the beginning, a lot has to do with him being a very, very sickly person, almost from birth. And his father was a philanthropist. So his father was a very upright person. He had a very stellar reputation. So his father was inculcating honesty and honor into him. Here's a guy who helped found the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You know, a guy who wasn't interested in making more money. He had plenty of money, but he was very interested in morals and morality. And I think TR formed almost an instinctive personality trait, I would say, character almost from the beginning, weakness and strength, good and bad. You work hard, you overcome your weakness, you overcome your sickness, you do the right things, therefore you prevail. That seems to be a pattern of his entire life. He never thought about doing anything but the right thing. If it didn't work, he'd work harder and eventually probably walk away. But I think, I don't know, but I think that had a lot to do with his character formation. Clearly, it was very, very well formed, and I don't want to insult too many of the lawyers here, but he went to Columbia Law School, and one of the reasons he dropped out is they were sleazy, as far as he was concerned. That was one of his reasons for dropping out of Columbia Law School. He didn't have much taste for people that saw both sides of the issue. You know, to him, there was only the right side and the wrong side. You know, and it didn't matter if you risked your life to do the right thing, as he proved and his sons proved. You had to do the right thing. It was a moral, that's it, moral imperative. We've studied the moral imperative.
Right.
Because he didn't even think about it. It was instinctive. That's my opinion.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think we're going to call it quits here. Nolan, you may know something about orchids and certificates and everything like that, and you may know the Old Guard salute. But we're going to go through the at least for the sake of our visitors, and also because we love you, Nolan. There's a certificate, so that's good, and everybody's unmuted now, so we can all cheer it and applaud for Nolan. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for those of you who are sticking on. And don't go away, because Tom Tobich has an announcement. But let's go. Old Guard salute.